So you want to get a handle on the China-United States trade war. It feels like a story that's just been going on and on.
Yeah, and trying to sort through all the headlines and analysis, it can be, well, a bit much.
Exactly. And that's precisely why we're here today.
Consider this your streamlined guide. We're talking about a major economic conflict really shaping global events since, January 2018.
And we're going to dive into what kicked it off, the big moments, the escalations, and, the real-world impacts it's actually had.
Our mission is pretty simple, really. Just cut through the noise, give you the essential stuff you need.
We've pulled from the big picture on Wikipedia, but also a really detailed breakdown from the Eurasian Research Institute, the ERI.
Right, using both to bring you this concise analysis.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Where did these tensions actually come from? What lit the fuse?
Well, the core driver, according to our sources anyway, was the Trump administration really wanting China to change its ways.
Ways they saw as fundamentally unfair trade practices.
Exactly. And especially the big one, intellectual property theft.
Right. It wasn't just a vague feeling, though. They had specific pain points they kept bringing up.
Oh, absolutely. A whole list of issues they saw as unfair. Yeah. But IP theft, that was front and center.
They put some serious numbers on it, didn't they?
They did. The U.S. estimated the cost to American businesses was somewhere between $225 billion and, a massive $600 billion every year.
Wow. That's eye-watering.
Yeah. And the U.S. didn't just see it as, companies losing money. They saw it as undermining American innovation, hitting high-paying jobs. That was a core thing driving their approach.
And it wasn't just about copying logos, right? It went deeper.
Much deeper. Forced technology transfer was another huge concern.
That's where American companies basically had to hand over their tech secrets just to do business in China?
Pretty much, yeah. That was the allegation. Add to that the massive ongoing U.S. China trade deficit.
Which the U.S. saw as more proof that the playing field wasn't level.
Exactly. Evidence of these imbalanced trade practices.
Okay, so these complaints have been around for a while. What actually, triggered the big shift in 2018?
A few things lined up. Trump's 2016 campaign. Big focus on protectionism, promising to tackle these trade issues.
Right, that was a central theme.
Then, August 2017, he tasked the USTR, that's the United States Trade Representative.
The main trade policy agency.
Right. He tasked them to investigate China's economic practices.
And I recall that investigation wasn't exactly diplomatic.
No, it didn't mince words. The report came out March 2018, very critical, especially focusing on that alleged forced tech transfer and the economic costs.
So that report was kind of the green light for action?
You could say that. Right after that, the U.S. started putting tariffs on certain Chinese goods.
And they took other steps, too.
Yeah, they filed a case against China at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and put restrictions on Chinese investment in, high-tech sectors in the U.S.
And the justification for those tariffs linked right back to those initial complaints.
Yes. Robert Lighthizer, who was the USTR then, he explicitly said that tariffs were a response to the economic damage from IP theft and those foreign ownership rules that forced tech transfer.
It's interesting, too. Wasn't there already concern from U.S. businesses in China?
Absolutely. Even before all this kicked off, over half the members of the American Chamber of Commerce in China were worried about their IP leaking.
Okay, so the U.S. makes its move. How did China react? They weren't just going to accept it, surely.
Definitely not. The Xi Jinping administration pushed back hard. They called the U.S. actions nationalist protectionism.
And they retaliated.
Predictably, yes. They brought in their own measures, and that really set the stage for, everything that followed, the escalation.
Okay, so we've got the origins laid out. How did these first steps then, spiral into this full-blown trade war? What were the key moments?
Well, the timeline shows this pattern, right? Action, reaction, escalation. Late 2018, December, there was a brief pause.
At the G20 summit in Buenos Aires.
That's the one. Planned tariff hikes were put on hold. They agreed to a 90-day negotiation period.
Trying to hash out those big structural issues like the tech transfer, IP protection.
Exactly. Non-tariff barriers, cyber theft, all that stuff. They set a deadline, March 1st, 2019.
Sounds like a chance maybe to de-escalate, but that didn't quite pan out.
No, ultimately it didn't. And it's funny, around that same time, December 2018, Trump was claiming China was buying, quote, tremendous amounts of U.S. soybeans.
But the actual trade data didn't quite back that up.
Not really, no. Also, During this time, China was really ramping up its focus on developing its own IT solutions.
Yeah, the Xinchuang initiative.
Right, this push for like homegrown tech across their whole IT system. Probably, a direct response to the trade tensions and U.S. tech restrictions.
Makes sense. So 2019 rolls around, the negotiation deadline passes. Then what?
May 2019, Trump announces a big jump in tariffs from 10% up to 25% on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods.
And that went into effect pretty quickly, May 10th.
Yep. The official reason given was that China had supposedly backtracked on deals made during the talks.
And this is when that whole debate about who really pays for the tariffs got loud.
Oh, yeah. Trump kept saying the tariffs were mostly paid for by China.
But most economists disagreed.
Pretty much universally, yeah.
Yeah.
The consensus was, and still is largely, that American businesses and consumers are the ones paying through higher prices.
Right, because importers pass those costs on. What else happened in May 2019? It felt like a busy month.
It was. Mid-May, the U.S. put Huawei, the big Chinese tech company, on the Commerce Department's entity list.
Which basically cut them off from buying crucial U.S. parts and software.
Effectively, yes. Unless they got special licenses. Citing national security concerns, of course.
That must have been a huge blow to Huawei and China's response.
Swift. June 2019, China retaliated by raising its own tariffs on $60 billion of U.S. goods, just continuing that tit-for-tat cycle.
So then we get to 2020, obviously a year dominated by other global events. But the trade war didn't just disappear.
Not at all. It was still simmering. In January 2020, they actually signed the Phase 1 trade deal.
Ah, yes, the deal where China promised to buy a lot more U.S. stuff.
That's the one. An extra $200 billion in U.S. goods and services by the end of 2021 was the commitment.
But how did that deal actually play out?
Well, it's important to note, by the time Trump left office, American media widely saw that Phase 1 deal as basically a failure. It fell short.
So even with a signed deal, the core issues weren't really fixed.
That seems to be the common view, yeah. And moving ahead to 2022, we start seeing the WTO, the World Trade Organization, getting more involved, or trying to.
Right, the global trade referee. What was their role?
Well, December 2022, the WTO ruled that those U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum from 2018 actually broke global trade rules.
And did the U.S. accept that ruling?
Nope. The Biden administration disputed it, said they weren't removing the tariffs.
Interesting. Any other WTO rulings around then?
Also in December 2022, the WTO ruled against the U.S. again, saying that making Hong Kong products be labeled Made in China also broke trade rules.
And the U.S. reaction.
Rejected that one too. Meanwhile, China just kept pushing its own policies to boost domestic tech.
It really sounds like the WTO was struggling to enforce its rulings in this fight.
That's fair to say. Now, the outline also mentions events in 2025. Obviously, that's looking forward from when some of this info was put together, but what did it point to?
A projection or scenario, what did it suggest?
It suggested a really sharp, renewed escalation. Following new tariffs by Trump in 2025, China supposedly slashed its U.S. oil imports by 90%, turning more to Canada.
Wow, a 90% drop.
And then April 2025, this scenario has Trump hitting all Chinese imports with another 34% tariff, on top of an existing 20%, so a total of 54%.
54%, that's huge, and the EU got hit too.
Yep, a 20% duty on EU goods as well in this scenario.
Okay, so what was the imagined reaction to that?
Predictable, really. Both China and the EU vow retaliation. China announces an 84% tariff on U.S. goods.
84%.
And then raises it again to an incredible 125%.
The astronomical numbers.
Although, interestingly, in this scenario, Trump exempts electronics, like phones and computers, from those reciprocal tariffs, and China doubles down on getting oil from Canada instead of the U.S.
It definitely paints a picture of things spiraling completely out of control. Okay, let's shift gears slightly and dig into the ERI analysis, the Eurasian Research Institute. What did they identify as the core economic causes?
Right. The ERI analysis really zeroed in on a few key economic drivers. First, echoing the U.S. concerns, was that IP theft and forced technology transfer issue.
And they put that same huge cost estimate on it, up to $600 billion a year.
Yes, they highlighted that figure and stressed how the U.S. saw it as a direct threat to its high-wage jobs and, its whole innovation economy.
Makes sense. If your ideas are constantly being taken, it's hard to compete. What else did ERI point to?
They focused heavily on China's specific economic model, particularly the big role of state-owned enterprises, the SOEs.
Which are controlled by the Communist Party.
Exactly. And the ERI argues that the huge subsidies these SOEs get, plus a legal system where, let's say, the rule of law is limited, gives them an unfair advantage over global competitors.
So even though China talks about supporting multilateralism,
Their actual practices, the ERI suggests, often don't line up with their WTO commitments. It's seen as inconsistent.
so it's not just specific actions, but the fundamental structure of their economy.
That's a big part of the argument. The ERI also talked about China's own protectionist policies.
How so?
Well, they observe that China wants open markets globally for its stuff, its exports, but it's often reluctant to fully open its own market to foreign competition.
Which makes using the WTO dispute process difficult if one side isn't fully playing by the same rules.
Precisely. It makes resolving grievances really challenging.
And the final point from ERI was about China's currency, the exchange rate.
Yes, the renminbi. They referenced research suggesting it's been consistently undervalued, maybe 19% or even more on average.
And how does that act in trade terms?
An undervalued currency basically works like a tariff on imports coming into China and like a subsidy for China's exports going out. So it really influences global trade flows and competitiveness.
So ERI paints a picture where these deep-seated economic structures and policies were key drivers. Okay, let's look at the fallout. The consequences. How did this impact the U.S., China, and, everyone else?
Right. From the U.S. side, as we kind of mentioned, American media generally framed the Trump-era trade war as, well, not a success for the U.S.
And the ERI analysis seemed to back that up.
Largely, yes. They pointed out the tariffs meant higher prices for American consumers, and they were critical of that Phase 1 deal, too.
Quite critical of the deal.
Because it left China's existing tariffs on U.S. goods in place. Plus, American producers were still facing retaliation from China, while China was actually lowering tariffs for other countries.
Oh, so U.S. companies faced Chinese tariffs while competitors from elsewhere maybe didn't.
Exactly. Which could potentially even strengthen Chinese SOEs in the long run, according to ERI.
So the intended benefits for the U.S. didn't quite pan out, and maybe some negative effects too. What about U.S. public opinion, though?
Kind of split, it seems. That Harvard Capps Harris poll in January 2025, it showed 52% approval for the new tariffs on China.
But with a big political divide?
Oh, yeah, huge. 74% of Republicans approved, but only 34% of Democrats. And you saw mixed reactions among Republican senators, too. Some worried about trade wars hurting everyone. Others hoped it would lead to a better U.S. position eventually.
And there were specific worries, too, like during the pandemic.
Definitely. Big concerns about tariffs on medical supplies, since China's such a key supplier. And after those hypothetical 2025 tariff hikes, fears about wider trade wars, recession, and, massive price increases for consumers, like the $2,300 iPhone example.
Okay, let's flip to China's perspective. How did they experience the trade war?
Inside China, you had differing views. Some officials, some economists wanted a quick end to it. Others were like, no, we need to push back hard against the U.S. pressure.
And the government's official?
They consistently saw the U.S. demands for big structural economic changes as basically interfering with their national sovereignty, an attack on their system.
How about the Chinese public?
Reports suggest they were initially quite surprised when the trade war really erupted. And later, following those potential 2025 tariffs, Xi Jinping's message was defiant. China is not afraid, alongside announcing those huge retaliatory tariffs.
Okay. And the rest of the world? Watching these two giants go at it, how did they react?
Well, internationally, you saw a kind of growing pushback against China's trade practices, generally some of the same concerns the U.S. raised initially.
So not just a U.S. China issue?
No. But there were also concerns voiced, especially by the EU, about the U.S. just ignoring WTO rulings. That worried other countries.
What else were people saying globally?
You had comments like the former Mexican ambassador to China saying, basically, everyone's tired of how China games the trading system. A former World Bank chief economist noted how unusual it was to see developed countries trying to open up developing markets. Usually it's the other way around. Interesting observation.
Yeah. And a Georgetown professor suggested maybe countries needed to form a coalition to tackle China's practices together.
And the EU planned a retaliation, too, in that 2025 scenario.
Yes. They weren't just bystanders. The UN weighed in, too, saying the trade war was hurting both the U.S. and Chinese economies.
And bigger picture concerns.
Lots of talk about economic decoupling, supply chains shifting away from China. Some saw potential winners, maybe countries like Vietnam or Taiwan picking up diverted trade.
It's clear the ripple spread far and wide. Lastly, the ERI analysis offered some advice, some lessons for developing countries navigating all this. What were the key takeaways there?
The ERI had several points for developing economies dealing with China. First, understand that when you deal with the Chinese SOE, you're essentially dealing with the Chinese state itself.
So be aware of the political dimension.
Right. Also be aware of national security concerns if you're talking mergers, acquisitions, or selling strategic resources to Chinese SOEs.
Makes sense. What else? They advise countries to really think about how China's industrial policies and subsidies might affect their own industrial development plans.
Do a thorough cost-benefit analysis before jumping in.
Exactly. Proper economic assessments, looking at both the good and the bad. And importantly, negotiate for mutual market access. Don't just give concessions unilaterally.
Try to get something back.
Yes.
Yeah.
And finally, make sure any dispute settlement process, while recognizing China's economic weight, still sticks to established WTO norms and rules.
Some really practical advice there for countries trying to manage these complex relationships. Okay, so to kind of wrap up our deep dive here, it's clear this trade war is incredibly complex. No easy answers.
Not at all. It started with those long-standing U.S. worries about fair play, IP, tech transfer.
And then escalated pretty wildly, right? Tit-for-tat tariffs, huge disruptions, reactions all over the globe.
Exactly. And whether it worked or not depends entirely who you ask. American media mostly says no. China remains defiant.
And the fallout goes way beyond just dollars and cents. We're talking national security, tech races, the future of global trade rules.
It touches everything.
It really does. This has been a really fascinating look at a complicated, ongoing situation. You know, thinking about that sharp escalation projected for 2025 and these very different views on whether the trade war actually achieved anything.
Yeah.
What long-term shifts do you think we might see in the global economy, in the U.S. China relationship itself?
And what role can bodies like the WTO even play anymore, realistically, in managing these kinds of deep-seated tensions between major powers? It's definitely something to chew on.